In the bitter November of 1887, while every other homesteader was stuffing windows with wool and hammering storm shutters, Charles Dunham did the unthinkable. He bricked all his windows shut. Then, on the blank outer walls, he painted windows so perfect that neighbors laughed and called it the theater house. They said he'd lost his mind. But when the worst freeze in living memory shattered glass across the valley and turned ordinary houses into tombs, they began to wonder, what had Charles seen that they had not, and was his strange fortress a sanctuary or a grave? Charles Dunham was a 37-year-old homesteader who had weathered 6 winters in the Red River Valley. By November of 1887, he no longer trusted glass to hold back the cold. Instead of mounting storm shutters like everyone else, he bricked every window opening shut. Then on the bleak exterior walls, he painted windows so perfect that they fooled the eye from a dozen yards away. Sashes, panes, even painted shadows. The valley called his cabin the theater house and laughed. But Charles had been studying something most settlers dismissed as foolish talk. Heat moves like water, and glass is a sieve. The winter that was already gathering above the plains would soon turn that laughter into silence. The Red River Valley in 1887 was still raw frontier, a flat land where the wind came unimpeded from the Arctic with nothing but barbed wire and stubborn wheat to slow it. Homesteaders there measured prosperity by 2 things: cordwood stacked high and the thickness of frost on the inside of their window glass. Charles Dunham and his wife Ida had both in number, but Charles no longer believed in numbers. He had started watching heat instead, how it moved, how it leaked, how it abandoned a room through the very glass that promised comfort. And what he saw disturbed him more than any blizzard forecast. So in early November he did the unthinkable. He bricked over every single window in their small cabin. He didn't board them. He dismantled the frames, chipped out the last stubborn splinters, and laid course after course of clay brick mixed with straw to keep the mortar from cracking in the cold. The work left the house blind, dark as a storage cellar. Ida watched in silence from the hearth, one hand resting on her unborn child. Their 3-year-old daughter, Lottie, sat on the floor tracing patterns in the firelight, confused by the sudden dimness at noon. Then Charles started painting. On the raw brick, he recreated what he had just destroyed. Sash windows, 6 panes each, painted with careful strokes of white and gray, complete with shadows that slanted as if the sun were falling across glass. From 20 feet away, they looked real enough to fool a traveler. Close up, the illusion was almost mocking, a painted promise of light where there was only wall. The first time a neighbor rode past and saw the windows, he laughed so hard he nearly slid off his horse. By week's end, the whole valley called it the theater house. The Dunhams became a running joke, but Charles noticed something the jokers didn't. The cabin stayed warm. The firewood pile shrank slower. While other folks battled drafts through every window frame, their single-room home held heat like a sealed oven. He knew the danger, of course. Airtight spaces suffocated. Moisture from breath and cooking would eventually condense on cold walls and turn to ice, cracking bricks and lungs alike. So he had planned for that before the first brick was laid. He built a small copper vent pipe into the ceiling, operated by a simple damper, and far more importantly, he had torn a hole in the roof. For days, neighbors watched him working above the ridge beam in the biting wind, assuming he was patching shingles. But Charles was framing a new opening, a shallow light well that he capped with thick, angled glass salvaged from an abandoned church in Fargo. A clear story, he called it. Ida called it their winter sun. The glass faced south, catching the low arc of the season's light and funneling it downward into the room through a core of still air. The bricked windows stopped the heat from escaping. The skylight let the day pour in without opening the house to the wind. The cold glass was outside the living envelope, separated from the cabin's warmth by a column of dead space. It was the work of weeks, careful, exhaustive, defiant. Word traveled. A weathered old Dane named Georgian Mikkelsen, who had lost 2 sons to a winter storm in '79, rode up one afternoon to see the curiosity. He stood before the painted windows, arms crossed, beard crusted with frost, and didn't laugh. He walked around the cabin twice. Then he looked up at the dark roofline where the new glass assembly sat like a strange, angular chimney. "You think a bit of painted brick can stop what's coming?" he asked. Charles didn't answer. Georgian pointed a thick finger toward the northern sky. "I've seen glass shatter from cold alone. I've seen houses split open when the wet in the walls froze. You sealed this place like a jar. It'll breathe its own death." Charles finally spoke. "Glass doesn't conduct what it can't touch." He didn't explain further. Georgian left shaking his head, carrying the same certainty Gideon Pike once carried. New ideas were just old mistakes dressed up. Inside the cabin, however, Ida began to notice details beyond the warmth. The light from above was not harsh. It fell like a column of diluted milk through the small opening, bright enough to sew by, but soft enough that Lottie's shadow barely appeared on the wooden floor. Frost never formed on the inner bricks. The vent damper allowed just enough exchange to keep the air fresh without pulling out the heat. Charles had been testing it each night, adjusting the flap by feel, reading the room like a ship's captain reading ballast. The house was not blind. It had a single eye, aimed at the sky, and it saw all the daylight the winter offered. By early December, the valley began to feel the first true press of cold. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in one afternoon. Tree limbs cracked with reports like distant gunfire. Neighbors restuffed their window sashes with rags, sealed cracks with tallow, and burned their wood recklessly to fight the seeping chill. The Dunham cabin, by contrast, sat in an eerie stillness, its dark brick walls absorbing nothing of the wind's intrusion. Lottie played near the stove while Ida knitted, and the only sound from outside was the steady whistle of air passing over the glass cap on the roof, distant, disinterested. Then the reports came from the north. A hard freeze was moving down from the Canadian Shield, colder than anything in living memory. Old-timers called it a white death. Fargo thermometers were expected to plunge past 40 below zero. Wind would turn exposed skin to dead meat in minutes. Animals would freeze upright. And windows, ordinary windows, would crack under the thermal shock, spilling glass like shrapnel into the houses that trusted them. That evening, a small crowd gathered at the Valley store to discuss preparations. Someone mentioned the theater house. The laughter had faded. Now the questions were sharper. What would happen to a man sealed inside a brick tomb when the air inside turned wet and froze? Would the painted windows be the last thing anyone saw from the outside before the whole cabin became a solid block of ice? Georgian Michelson was there. He said nothing. But he looked south toward the Dunham claim, where a thin thread of smoke rose straight into the steel sky, and a single shaft of pale light glowed from the peak of the roof, visible now in the dark. Something about that light made him uneasy. It was watching the clouds gather, waiting. Charles stood below it, one hand on the damper rope, listening to the wind begin its long howl across the valley. He had bricked himself and his family inside a blind house with one eye open to the frozen heavens, and the coldest night ever recorded was now less than 12 hours away. If his single glass lens failed, or if the dead air column somehow bridged the cold into the warm, there would be no time to tear down the bricks. This house would become their tomb, sealed by his own hands. The howl deepened. The first crystal dust of snow began to strike the skylight like sand. And Charles realized he had not calculated for one thing. What happens when the storm buries the roof glass in snow, and the single eye goes dark forever? The storm did not announce itself with a slow build. It landed like a hammer on an anvil. At 10 minutes past midnight on December 11th, the wind shifted due north, and the temperature dropped from -5 to -38 in less than 2 hours. Timber cracked in the surrounding woods with sounds like musket shots. Inside the Dunham cabin, Lottie woke screaming. Charles was already at the base of the light well, staring upward. The pale moon glow that had marked the skylight was gone, swallowed whole. Snow packed against the glass in thick, wet layers, driven horizontal by the gale. The single eye of the house had closed. Ida pulled Lottie to her chest beside the stove while Charles listened to the roof. Not to the wind, but to the silence inside the chimney of dead air above them. If the glass cracked now, 40 below cold would pour down that shaft like water through a broken dam. But Charles had not built a passive skylight. He had built a controlled shaft with a man inside it. He lifted a narrow trapdoor set into the ceiling beside the light well, revealing a wooden ladder that climbed into the column of darkness. Lottie watched, eyes wide, as her father disappeared upward with a lantern hooked to his belt. The air grew colder with every rung until Charles was crouched on a small platform 2 feet below the glass, his breath clouding in white pulses. The glass was frosted over but intact. Outside, snow pressed against it with the weight of a dead body. He reached for the long cedar pole he had stored here in October, waxed, smooth, 10 feet long, capped with a padded leather ball. He had positioned the skylight on a 45-degree pitch, steep enough that snow would slide naturally in dry cold. This was no dry cold. This was wet, heavy, lake-effect snow that clung and piled until it sealed itself into a frozen crust. But the pitch still gave him one advantage. Anything loosened would fall away, not push inward. Charles slid the pole through a small, leather-sealed aperture beside the glass, a port he had designed specifically for this moment, and began to work the crust free. The pole scraped against ice. The wind howled in protest. Chunks of frozen snow tumbled down the roof slope and vanished into the blizzard. After 4 agony-long minutes, light returned, thin, gray, but light. The glass held. When Charles descended, Ida was waiting with a wool blanket and a look that said nothing because everything had already been said. The temperature inside the cabin was 52 degrees. Outside, it was nearly 40 below and falling, but the bricks had done more than block drafts. They had absorbed heat from the stove all evening and were now radiating it back so slowly that the cabin lost less than 2 degrees per hour with the fire at half feed. The walls themselves had become a thermal battery. No neighbor could say the same. By 3 in the morning, the first window failed in the Johnson cabin 2 miles east. Not cracked, exploded. The thermal shock of the glass hitting 40 below split the pane in half, and the wind did the rest, sending glass shards into the room like a shotgun blast. Georgian Michelson woke to his youngest daughter screaming in blood. He spent the next hour tacking horse blankets over the frame while the cold ate through his walls. By dawn, 7 more homesteads had lost at least one window each. The valley was filling with the sound of hammers and desperation, but inside the theater house, something strange was beginning to happen. The snow that had been driven against the brick walls was now drifting upward in curious patterns, banking against the west side but curling away from the east. Charles had angled the painted window frames not just for illusion, but for wind deflection. The raised brick sashes, built out 3 inches from the wall with hollow cores behind them, broke the clean airflow around the cabin. They created microeddies that prevented drift from piling unevenly against the structure. Even the fake windows were engineered. By midday on December 12th, the temperature reached 46 below zero. The valley had frozen solid. Livestock died standing up. A team of mules froze so fast in their traces that a neighbor had to chop them free with an axe. In the Dunham cabin, the stove burned steadily, but Charles was watching a new problem. The vent damper was icing over. Moisture from their breath condensed inside the copper pipe and froze along the seams, slowly shrinking the airway. The air inside grew heavy, thick with the smell of smoke and sleep. Ida felt it before Charles spoke. She felt the faint dizziness when standing, the slow pulse in her temples. Candle flames burned orange instead of yellow, a silent warning of carbon dioxide building past safe limits. Charles took a second rod from beside the ladder, a thinner iron rod with a spiral tip, designed to ream the vent pipe from inside. He climbed the ladder through the light well until he reached the vent junction and began to twist the rod upward through the pipe. Ice crystals rained down onto his shoulders. He twisted until he felt the rod break through the cap, and suddenly a thin whistle of air returned. Down below, the candle flame steadied and brightened. Ida exhaled. The house breathed again, but that was when Charles noticed the new danger. The glass cap of the skylight was holding, yet the shaft itself was no longer acting as pure dead air. The extreme cold outside was leaching warmth through the glass just enough that the air column had begun to stratify. Warmer air rose, hit the cold glass, and cycled back down. Convection had started inside his dead space, and with it, a slow but steady loss of heat through the roof. The machine he had built was failing not because of any single break, but because the laws of physics were catching up at 46 below. He had maybe 12 hours before the entire light well turned into a cold chimney that would pull every degree of warmth out of the cabin. The pivot came from a direction no one expected. While Charles was calculating timber spans and heat loads on a scrap of paper, Ida stood, walked to the wood pile, and lifted a heavy cast-iron pot filled with sand and pebbles from beside the hearth. She set it directly on the stove top and let it heat until the sand was too hot to touch. Then, using thick rags, she carried the pot to the base of the light well and set it on the floor directly beneath the glass column. Sand radiated heat upward into the shaft, warming the air column and breaking the convection loop. The cold air stopped sinking. The shaft restabilized. The single eye stayed open. It was an idea Charles had not written down, a thermal dam, a heat mass that created a zone of rising warmth too strong for the cold to fall through. Ida had solved the problem not with carpentry, but with the same principle that kept women alive on the open plains when their menfolk were gone, a hot stone under a blanket. The theater house had a second engineer, and she had been watching all along. The third night of the storm delivered a threat the design had never anticipated. The wind shifted west-southwest, a rare reversal that the valley walls usually protected against. Now, snow drove directly across the roof instead of sliding off the pitched glass. The skylight began to accumulate a drift from a different angle, packing against the edge like wet cement. Charles cleared it with the pole 4 times. The 5th time, the pole snapped. The leather ball end broke loose and the bare cedar scratched against the glass edge, leaving a hairline fracture that hissed with escaping warmth. The crack did not shatter immediately, laminated by layers of ice, but Charles could feel the cold pouring through it, a needle of death aimed into the room. If the glass failed completely, the temperature inside would fall below freezing within 15 minutes. Ida and Lottie would die before morning. He did not hesitate. He climbed down from the ladder, grabbed a tin of pine pitch from the hearth shelf, heated it over the stove until it smoked, and carried the molten glue back up into the light well. With a wooden paddle, he smeared the hot pitch into the crack until it sealed solid against the frozen pane. The hissing stopped. Then he took 2 heavy wool blankets, soaked them in melted tallow, and stretched them across the inner frame of the skylight as a secondary barrier. The light dimmed further, but the glass was no longer the only defense. It was now just the outer shell of a 3-layer shield. The cabin grew darker, but it held. By the morning of December 14th, the valley had lost track of time. Neighbors trapped in shattered houses burned their furniture to stay alive. Georgian Michelson huddled with his daughters beneath a mountain of blankets, his cabin now a frozen cave with one open window covered only by a frozen horse blanket. He had seen the light of the Dunham cabin from a distance during a brief lull in the snow, a single warm point that refused to die. He had called it a tomb. Now it looked like an ark. Inside, Lottie played with wooden blocks near the stove while Ida sat at the table, sewing by the dim glow of a lamp, her face calm. Charles had not slept in 3 days, but the cabin had not fallen below 48 degrees in 72 hours. They had used less than half the cordwood a normal winter night would demand. The brick walls, hot stones, and layered roof shield had created a kind of hibernation that the storm could not penetrate. The theater had become a fortress built of heat, but the door handle was now frozen solid on the outside, and the drift had climbed above the roof edge, sealing them in with no exit. And inside the vent pipe, ice was growing again, this time visible, a slow ring of frost that no rod could reach because it had formed at an elbow behind the wall. The air grew thick once more. Ida's head began to ache. The candle flames dimmed. The house was losing its breath, and this time Charles had no rod long enough to reach the blockage. The only way to clear it was from the outside, through the blizzard, onto the roof in 60 below wind chill, with no rope long enough to anchor him and no visible horizon to guide his way back. If he went out, he might not return. If he didn't, the air would thicken into poison within hours. The single eye of the house was watching him now, waiting for a choice that had no correct answer. Charles looked at the vent pipe elbow, at the frost ring growing like a living thing inside the wall, and then at Ida. He did not speak because there were no words left that did not mean saying goodbye. He pulled on every layer he owned, 2 wool shirts, the heavy sheepskin coat, a scarf wrapped twice around his face until only his eyes showed, and then he tied the longest rope in the cabin to the cast-iron leg of the stove. The stove was bolted to no floor, but it weighed more than a man and glowed with stored heat that could anchor a line in wood and hope. He tied the other end around his waist with a bowline knot, the kind sailors used to haul men from frozen seas. Ida did not argue. She placed the hot sand pot near the door to create a small buffer and then gathered Lottie into her lap, pressing the child's face into wool so Lottie would not see her father step into oblivion. Charles lifted the heavy wooden bar from the door brackets, threw his shoulder against the frame, and the door cracked open with a scream of ice. The blizzard swallowed the cabin, white and blind and 65 below with wind howl. He stepped out into nothing. The rope pulled taut behind him. One hand on the line, the other on a small hatchet, he moved along the wall toward the east corner where a wooden ladder still stood, frozen against the bricks. Drift had buried the lower rungs, but he dug with the hatchet until he could climb. Each step on the ladder felt like stepping onto broken glass. The wind tore at the scarf, exposed the skin at his wrists, and began to burn. He reached the roof edge and crawled upward on the steep pitch, feeling for the vent pipe with frozen fingers. The snow had packed around it like concrete. He chipped at the ice with the hatchet, then reached into the pipe with a stiff wire he had carried in his sleeve, breaking through the frost plug. Warm air hissed out, instantly freezing into a ghost of steam that the wind shredded. The vent was open, but when he tried to descend, he found that his left glove had frozen to the vent pipe. He pulled and the glove tore away, leaving bare skin in contact with iron. The cold bit instantly, a pain so sharp it felt like fire, and then nothing. He knew what that meant. He ripped his hand free, skin peeling onto the metal, and began to crawl backward down the roof, one arm cradled against his chest. The rope guided him to the ladder, then to the ground, then to the door that Ida held open from within, a tiny wedge of orange light in a world that was otherwise gone. He fell inside, and she slammed the door shut behind him. The vent pipe began to whistle again, steady and clean. Ida plunged his frozen hand into a bowl of cool water, not warm, never warm because rapid thawing would destroy the tissue. The cabin's heat would do the rest slowly. Charles sat with his back to the warm bricks, shivering so hard that his teeth chattered like castanets, and watched his daughter playing with a wooden spoon as though nothing had changed. The house, however, had changed in a way he could not yet see. Because while he was on the roof, while the door was cracked open and the rope held, a figure had seen him from the white gloom. Georgian Mikkelsen had been struggling home from his shattered cabin to fetch the last of his grain stores when he spotted the faint glow of the Dunham door and the dark shape of a man crawling up a ladder into the storm. He thought it was a death wish. But 15 minutes later, when he had fought his way to within 100 yards, he saw the man descend again and disappear inside, and the rope was pulled in and the door closed, and the light stayed on. No one had died. The theater house was still alive. He could not stop himself. He waded through the drifts to the door and pounded with a frozen fist until Ida opened it a second time. What he saw inside made him forget the storm entirely. The first thing he noticed was the light, not from a fire or a lamp, but from above. A pale column of daylight, filtered through the snow-crusted skylight, fell into the center of the room like water from a well. The second thing he noticed was that there were no windows. He was standing inside a sealed brick box with painted illusions on the walls, and yet the space was brighter than his own cabin had ever been on a sunny winter noon. The third thing he noticed was the warmth. The air was not merely tolerable, it was soft, almost spring-like after the killing cold outside. And the stove was on half feed. For a very long time, Georgian said nothing. The old Dane who had called this place a tomb now stood in it and felt his frozen beard beginning to thaw. He looked from the painted sash windows to the light shaft to the vent pipe to the hot stones arrayed around the floor. Then he looked at Charles, whose hand lay wrapped and useless, and whose skin was still gray from the near-death cold, and a single question finally forced itself past his lips. "You knew the windows would break across the whole valley, didn't you?" Charles did not nod, but he did not shake his head. He spoke quietly, the words still strung with shivers. "Glass loses heat 14 times faster than brick. A window is a hole in your defense that you pay to look through. I stopped paying." Georgian turned and stared at the painted pane nearest the stove, 6 perfect squares, white-edged, a shadow sloping downward as though the afternoon light were falling through from outside. The shadow did not move. It was frozen in a permanent 3 o'clock. And that was when Georgian understood the real twist, the one that would crack the valley's understanding open like a frozen pane. Charles had not given up light. He had moved it. The skylight did more than illuminate. It captured the low winter sun and trapped the day's brief heat in a column of still air that sank slowly downward, warming the room by degrees that no one could feel individually but everyone could survive by cumulatively. The bricks held the stove's heat. The hot stones stabilized the air column. The painted frames broke the wind outside. And the single eye on the roof, angled south, drank the sun even through clouds. The house was not a theater. It was a thermal machine that had turned physics into a fortress while the rest of the valley trusted glass. Word spread faster than the storm. By the following day, 2 other families had heard from Georgian's daughters that the Dunham cabin was not only standing but warm, and they began to move toward it through the nearly impassable drifts. The McAllister brothers, who had lost 3 windows and were burning their barn wood to keep a single room above freezing, arrived first. They found Charles outside, slowly clearing the drift from the east reflection wall with one good hand, as though the coldest week in memory were a mild inconvenience. They looked at the painted windows. They saw the skylight glowing from within, and they felt something shift in their understanding of what was possible. But then came something worse than the cold. The Johnson family, whose window had exploded on the first night, had been sheltering in their cellar with a sick infant for nearly 4 days. The mother, Ellen Johnson, was spotted crawling toward the Dunham claim with the baby wrapped against her chest, frostbite already blackening her earlobes, while her husband dragged a sled of blankets behind them. They were not coming to see the curiosity. They were coming because the Dunham cabin was the only place left in the valley where anyone might still be alive. Charles saw them emerge from the whiteout like ghosts out of myth. He knew instantly what it meant. His cabin could hold 4, maybe 5, without stressing the air exchange beyond its limits. But 8, 10, with a frozen infant and 2 broken men and the stove already burning at capacity. The thermal balance he had spent months engineering would collapse under the load of too many breathing lungs exhaling moisture into a space designed for 3. And if the moisture built up, if it condensed on the bricks and froze, the walls themselves would become a tomb, exactly as Georgian had once predicted. The machine had a limit, and it had just arrived on his doorstep wearing the face of desperate friends. He went inside to fetch the last of the tallow blankets, but his eyes met Ida's as he passed. She had seen the figures through the door crack, and she knew the same hard math. The house they had saved their child with might now demand they turn away their neighbors, and the storm outside had not yet reached its final peak. Far to the north, the sky was darkening again, building a second wave that would make the first feel like a warning. The theater house was about to face a test that had nothing to do with glass or brick, and everything to do with what a man is willing to sacrifice when the cold closes in. Charles stood in the doorway watching Ellen Johnson crawl toward him with a baby whose cries had gone silent, and he made the choice before his mind could catch up with his legs. He strode into the blizzard, scooped the infant from her arms, and carried it inside. Ida was already moving, clearing the table, spreading a wool blanket, placing the last hot sand pot beneath it. Within 5 minutes, the cabin that had been engineered for 3 held 9 souls. Charles knew exactly what that meant. The balance was broken. Now they would have to rebuild it by the hour. The first problem was moisture. Every exhaled breath from 9 people pumped water vapor into a space designed to stay dry. Within 30 minutes, The bricks nearest the door began to sweat. Charles pulled Lottie's chalk from the hearth and drew a line across the floor dividing the cabin into zones. The warm zone near the stove for the sick infant and Ellen, the breathing zone near the vent damper for the able men, and the still zone beneath the light well where air must remain undisturbed. No one crossed a line without his say. Georgian Mikkelsen looked at the chalk marks and recognized military discipline. He had served in the Danish army. He did not argue. The second problem was the vent. With more bodies breathing and the stove burning hotter to keep them all warm, the air exchange needed to double, but the pipe was still half narrowed by frost. Charles assigned the McAllister brothers to a rotation. One man remained near the damper rod, the other climbed the ladder into the light shaft and cleared the upper vent with a heated iron spike every half hour. The spike glowed dull red when Charles pulled it from the stove and handed it up. The cold in the shaft was so fierce that the iron hissed as it bit the ice, but the pipe stayed open and the candle flames inside stayed yellow. The third problem no one saw coming. The baby, silent for nearly an hour, began to cry again. The sound meant life, but it also meant the infant's body was demanding more oxygen and producing more condensation. A crying child breathes like a running adult. Charles realized that if they could not dry the air, the baby's own lungs would turn the cabin into a frost trap. Then Ida did something no one had seen before. She took a shallow pan of dried beans from the pantry, placed them on the stove until they were scorching, and then floated the pan on a small wooden board over a pot of snow. The cold pot drew moisture from the air, and the beans radiated heat upward to keep the convection layer stable. A makeshift dehumidifier built from pantry goods and frontier instinct. Within 20 minutes, the sweating bricks dried. The chalk lines on the floor remained, but the air inside them stayed breathable. The second wave of the storm struck on the evening of December 16th. This one came from the northwest, colder than the first, with wind speeds that flattened the snowdrifts and scoured the plains down to frozen dirt. Thermometers across the valley bottomed out at 53 below zero. The glass skylight, already weakened by the earlier fracture, began to sing, a high keening tone that meant the pane was flexing under the pressure differential. Charles heard it from the floor and looked up. If the glass blew in now, 9 people would freeze where they sat. He pointed at Georgian. "You said you ran a cavalry picket in winter. You know cold." Georgian nodded. "Get above and wrap the outer glass with the tallow blankets. Not inside, outside. You'll have 4 minutes before your hands stop working." Georgian climbed the ladder without a word, taking the last intact blanket and a coil of rope. He disappeared into the white maw of the blizzard through the roof hatch Charles had used earlier. The rope went taut. The keening stopped. When Georgian descended, his beard was a solid block of ice and his fingers were white to the second knuckle, but the glass was muffled and still. The light dimmed further, a twilight gloom at noon, but the eye of the house did not close. Charles checked the brick walls every hour after that, pressing his palm against the inner surface to feel for cold spots that would mean the thermal battery was draining. The walls stayed warm. The painted windows stayed warm. That was the detail that finally broke Georgian's silence. He pressed his own hand flat against a painted sash. 6 perfect panes, white brushstrokes, a shadow frozen at 3 o'clock, and the brick beneath his palm was not cold. It radiated a dull living heat, like the flank of a horse after a run. "What's behind the paint?" he asked. Charles glanced at Ida, who was feeding Lottie small pieces of dried apple by the stove. She gave the smallest nod. He took a chisel from the tool shelf and walked to the nearest painted window, the one that faced north where the wind was strongest. With Georgian holding the lantern, Charles scraped away a corner of the white paint, then a layer of sizing, and beneath that lay not bare brick but a thin sheet of polished tin pressed flat and mortared into the wall. Georgian stared at the metal, which caught the lantern light and threw it back into the room. "What is that?" he breathed. Charles touched the tin with his fingertip. "A mirror for heat. The brick holds the stove's warmth. The tin pushes it back into the room instead of letting it sink through the wall. Paint just keeps the tin from corroding." Georgian stepped back and looked at all 6 painted windows, each one a disguised heat shield, and the weight of the joke the valley had told all winter collapsed into nothing. The theater windows were never an illusion. They were armor. The baby survived the night. By dawn on December 17th, the storm had begun to fray at the edges, and the temperature rose to a balmy 30 below. Ellen Johnson's frostbite would take the tip of one ear, but her hands were saved. Her husband, who had been silent with shame since arriving, finally looked at Charles and asked the question everyone in the cabin had been holding. Could we build one? Charles took a piece of the chalk and drew on the floor, a circle for the light well, a line for the vent pipe, squares for the painted windows with tin backing, arrows for wind deflection. Georgian watched, then fetched a scrap of paper and began to copy the marks in charcoal. By the time the sun broke through the remnants of the cloud cover, and the skylight flared with sudden brilliance, 4 men had the rough plan memorized. They were not architects, but they had survived the worst winter in memory inside a machine built by a farmer with brick and glass and stolen church windows, and they were not going to forget. When the trails finally opened a week later, the valley looked like a battlefield of frozen corpses. Windowless houses stood like skulls with empty eye sockets. 47 homesteads had lost at least one room to shattered glass. 11 families had burned their furniture to coals and still lost children. The Johnson baby was one of 6 infants in the township to survive the freeze of 1887. The others were not so lucky. Georgian Michelson rode to the county seat and told the surveyor what he had seen. The surveyor called it Dunham's Folly. For another year before he finally visited the cabin himself, felt the tin-backed warmth with his own hand, and went quiet. Within 3 winters, 13 other homesteads in the Red River Valley had bricked their north windows and replaced south-facing walls with angled glass shafts. A doctor in Fargo wrote to a medical journal about the survival rate of infants in windowless homes during deep cold. The article was ignored by the cities but read aloud in frontier church meetings from Duluth to the Dakotas. The theater house had become a school. Charles never patented anything. When asked why he gave away the design, he said simply that a man who hoards fire in winter dies alone, and a man who shares it warms his own bones by the company he keeps. Ida lived to 91, long enough to see her granddaughter build a house with no north windows at all, a skylight that tracked the sun with adjustable shutters, and not a single pane of glass in the outer walls. But the detail that would never be recorded in any journal or newspaper came decades later, when the original Dunham cabin was finally dismantled to make way for a larger house. Beneath the floorboards, extending 3 feet into the frozen clay, Charles had buried a network of cedar logs hollowed out and filled with gravel. They were breathing tubes, passive earth-to-air heat exchangers that drew fresh air from beneath the frost line and warmed it before it entered the cabin. He had built a ground-source ventilation system with an axe and a shovel, and he had never spoken of it because it was never meant to be seen. It was meant to keep his family alive while the world above froze solid. The painted windows were visible. The buried lungs of the house were invisible, and they were still working when the cabin came down. When the last brick was pulled away and those hollow cedar logs were finally exposed to daylight for the first time in more than a century, the men doing the demolition stopped. They had never seen anything like it. A passive ventilation system buried beneath the frost line, built with nothing but an axe, a shovel, and an understanding of how the earth breathes. Charles Dunham had not simply outsmarted one winter. He had designed a house that could outlast every winter, and he had hidden its deepest secret beneath the floorboards where no one would think to look. The painted windows were a decoy. The real genius was invisible. That is the part of the story the Valley almost forgot. For years, people remembered the theater house as a curiosity, a farmer's eccentric gamble, a footnote in the brutal winter of 1887. They told jokes about the painted panes and the man who bricked himself into darkness. But the families who sheltered inside that warm brick box never joked again. They went home and changed the way they built. They stopped trusting glass to do a wall's job. They started asking questions about heat and moisture and air that most frontier builders never thought to ask. And some of them, the ones who paid closest attention, dug their own breathing tubes into the cold clay, and their children survived winters that killed others. Charles Dunham did not defeat the cold. He let it be cold. He studied its nature, mapped its flows, and then built something that worked with physics instead of against it. That is not just a survival story. It is a design philosophy hiding inside a legend, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone willing to look at an old problem with new eyes. The blizzard of 1887 shattered glass across the entire Red River Valley, but it also shattered the illusion that a window is harmless. A window is a hole, and sometimes the safest house is the one that looks blind to the outside world but sees the sun in a way no one else bothered to notice. We live in an age surrounded by glass we trust without thinking. Metaphorical windows, financial windows, technological windows that promise clarity and deliver fragility. The question Charles left behind is not about bricks or skylights. It is about whether we are paying attention to what we are relying on, and whether we have the courage to seal the openings that are bleeding warmth from our lives even when the neighbors laugh. Sometimes the wisest move is to brick the window and paint a better one, and to know that the light is still coming in from a direction no one else is watching. If stories like this remind you that forgotten ingenuity still has something to teach us, then you are in the right place. Subscribe now, and hit the bell so you never miss the next tale of someone who saw the world differently and built something that lasted long after the laughter stopped.